Over to you now, Dr. Priya. We are live now on YouTube.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this live webinar event. And what is the launch of our Salisis regional webinar series centered around what has now affected the daily lives of almost everyone in the world today, COVID-19. Can our presenters mute their mic until they're ready to come on? Please. Our next event is scheduled for June 5th, and details would soon be made available. I am Priya Mohan, Research Fellow at Salisis St. Augustine campus, and would be your moderator for this event. COVID-19 is a complex global crisis, and we are all adjusting to the new normal. We at Salisis, guided by our University Director, Professor Audrey Henry Lee, and supported by our campus directors, Dr. Don Marshall and Dr. Hamid Ghani, felt that as a research institute, our voices should be added to the discourse. The Salisis, or the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, is a research and graduate teaching entity located within the University of the West Indies School of Graduate Studies and Research on the Mona campus, the Cave Hill campus, and the St. Augustine campus. The mandate of the Salisis is to conduct training and research of a regional, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and policy-oriented nature to serve the needs of the Caribbean and the wider global space. The Institute focuses on social, economic, and political issues. While COVID-19 remains very much a health crisis with rising infections and deaths worldwide, we are not medical professionals, nor do we have medical professionals on our panel here today. We remain guided first and foremost by the medical advice of these professionals and those in authority. We are nevertheless economists and social scientists, and COVID-19 is most definitely spreading economic suffering worldwide. The virus may in fact be as contagious economically as it is medically. Our goal today, therefore, is to share our research and to influence the academic and public debate on the economic implications of COVID-19. Our panel today is entitled COVID-19 and Fiscal Sustainability, Debt, Balance of Payments, and Financing for Development. We have three distinguished scholars who will present in the order in which I introduce them and their topic. First, we will have Dr. Kevin Williams, Research Fellow at Salisis Mona. He'll be speaking on COVID-19 and the global supply chain implications for SIDS, Small Island Developing States. Following this, we'll have Dr. Andre Horton, Senior Lecturer and Senator in the Department of Economics, Mona. He'll be speaking on COVID-19 and debt sustainability. And finally, we'll have Dr. Don Marshall, Director of Salisis Cave Hill, and he'll be speaking on COVID-19 and financing for development. Each presenter would have 15 minutes to present. All three presentations would take place, followed by our question and answer session. While the presentations are taking place, you, the audience, can send your questions in using the chat or comment section. After all three presentations, I shall then pose your questions to the panelists. Comments from Salisis fellows and other academic staff will also be taken. With that said, I hand you all over now to Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Dr. Priya, for that wonderful introduction. I'll now share my screen with the audience. Can I share my screen?
Sure, Dr. Williams. Hit the share screen.
I'm getting host disabled participant screen sharing. I'm getting a window saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
All right. Go ahead and let me enable it.
Okay.
Let's start the presentation.
Ready, Richard? Am I sharing it, Richard?
One sec, Dr. Williams. I said, go ahead, try and start without it. I'm checking the settings. It's saying that it's share. So let me just check. One sec. I don't know if you can go ahead and start.
Okay. All right. Okay. Like the rest of the world, COVID-19 has affected Caribbean cities on many fronts. For example, the hospitality sector, financial sector, manufacturing sector, and importantly, the flow of remittances. Before COVID-19, Jamaica was on a growth path with an expectation that debt burden would be reduced to 60% of GDP by 2026. COVID-19, however, has changed that trajectory. Given their small markets and heavy reliance on imports, the slowdown in international trade caused by COVID-19 magnified the vulnerabilities faced by Caribbean cities. Now, the key question: what is the impact of COVID-19 on international trade? Further, what does this mean for Caribbean cities? The first thing you need to know, I think, is that firms trade with each other within and between countries. For example, you have trading across borders, is termed international trade, while we have trade between firms locally. The old-fashioned approach to production decision is that firms kept supplies at hand to smooth fluctuations in demand. But that is the old-fashioned approach to production. Now, today, by contrast, to maximize efficiency and thus increase profit, the modern firm pursues so-called just-in-time production. That is, firms produce goods to supply current demand. In other words, firms are not building up inventories. The idea is that it is costly to construct warehouses and put in place all the other infrastructure to store inventories. So inventory is a cost that the modern firm is today trying to forego. Now, given those two approaches to production decision, a natural experiment, in my view, is presented by COVID-19. This natural experiment enables us to sort of test the relative efficiency of those two production decisions. That is, firms building up inventory to smooth production as opposed to just-in-time production. Now, it's clear in this COVID-19 pandemic that the just-in-time production could not satisfy increased demands for essential goods. And we have seen that, for example, with, say, essential medical supplies. One can readily identify personal protective equipment. Now, it's not unreasonable, in my view, to argue that the just-in-time production could have possibly accelerated deaths across the world. Coupled with the just-in-time production is the so-called fragmentation of production. This fragmentation of production is another element of the modern firm's approach to achieve efficiency. That is, different parts of the same final good are made in various countries. So one can think about, say, a car or a bike that is, say, assembled in China with parts made in Germany, parts made in the US, parts made in Vietnam. Now, given that fragmentation of production, one can readily identify the inefficiency of that approach to production. Firms do this, pursue the fragmentation of production to maximize efficiency, the so-called hyper-specialization. Now, how does all of that affect international trade? Just-in-time production and fragmentation of production make international trade more susceptible to both exogenous and endogenous shock. In this case, exogenous shock is the COVID-19, and endogenous shock is, for example, interstate wars between countries. Now, when states close their borders to prevent the spread of COVID-19, the global supply chain came to a standstill. So what are the implications of the global supply chain coming to a standstill for Caribbean states? Caribbean states are net importers of manufactured goods and exporters of commodity. Also, Caribbean states are highly dependent on service industry. Disruption in international trade arising from COVID-19 reduces demand for commodities and creates scarcity for manufactured goods. So, for example, we see that a massive reduction in oil price, that has implication for the balance of trade in the case of Trinidad and Guyana. Seeds are more susceptible to a slowdown in international trade. Seeds do not have the capacity to switch from producing light manufactured goods to producing more sophisticated manufactured goods. Now, the US, for example, can invoke the Defense Production Act that forced domestic firms to produce sophisticated manufactured goods. So we see that the US forced, say, M3 to produce N95, and firms within the auto industry, the government of the United States forced some of those firms within the auto industry to produce PPE. Caribbean states do not have that capacity. We cannot switch, Caribbean states cannot switch from producing light manufactured goods to producing sophisticated goods. We just do not have that deep human capital to do that.
Okay, Dr. Williams, go ahead and share your screen now. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, sorry.
Let's keep it out there. click on the share screen.
Okay, Richard.
Select your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Sorry about that technical glitch.
I am coming.
All right. So you click on share screen and click the PowerPoint that's open. If you're having issues and you want to continue without it, you could go ahead. But just to let you know, you'll be able to share your screen now.
Okay. All right. Let me proceed.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let me continue, Richard, while I'll sort it out. So as I was saying, weak demand for commodities suggests that Caribbean states, as I said before, are likely to face balance of payment issues, and in this case, Trinidad and oil price. Jamaica is not unaffected in this, and therefore we see that Jamaica had to return to the IMF under the rapid instrument facility to shore up its balance of payment. Even more susceptible to COVID-19 is the service industry and migrant remittances. These are the two main sources of hard currency for Jamaica. Demand for hard currencies we have seen increase because of this COVID-19. Investors, the idea is that in developing countries like the Caribbean states, when there is a shock, whether endogenous or exogenous, in this case exogenous, investors tend to flee for safety. That is, they switch from local currency to foreign currency. We have seen that towards the end of March, in April, and towards the beginning of May. The Bank of Jamaica had to intervene to supply US currency and to calm down the market, that Jamaica has enough reserve, Jamaica has enough foreign currency to supply the market. So that's a key implication of this COVID-19, is that investors tend to flee for safety, that is, switch from local currency to foreign currency. Luckily, the Jamaican Authority, in particular, the Bank of Jamaica, has enough hard currency to calm the market in Jamaica. Now, is there a way out for Caribbean states? Well, it's difficult for Caribbean states given our natural vulnerabilities. The fortune of Caribbean states, I believe, is hinged on what goes on in the rest of the world. So Caribbean states need a strong global economy. And that's key. A weak global economy means that Caribbean states, a weak global economy suggests that Caribbean states, the economies in Caribbean states is unable to grow, is unable to develop resilience to external and internal shocks. Now, the speed at which the hospitality sector in Caribbean states, for example, in Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, the speed at which the hospitality sector and migrant remittances recovers will be a function of whether economies in North America return to full employment. The implication of this is that Caribbean seeds need to diversify its portfolio of trading relationship. So Caribbean seeds may need to look to Africa. Africa is expected to, the population size in Africa over the next several decades is expected to be the largest in the world. India, the population in India, based on the United Nations projection, is expected to increase exponentially. Not only increase, but the youth in India is expected to account for the largest share of working age labor. So Caribbean seeds need to look to India and Africa in order to reduce any shock arising from North America, because as it is today, Caribbean seeds are highly dependent on North America. So anything that, any shocks to the economy of North America, Canada, and the US is rapidly transmitted to the economies in Caribbean seeds. Now, another way, in my view, that Caribbean seeds can cushion disaster-like shocks, such as COVID-19, is by pursuing sound macroeconomic policies in normal times. And that is important. In normal times, Caribbean seeds need to pursue sound macroeconomic policies, including low and stable inflation, low interest rate, avoid wasteful public spending, maintain adequate reserves, and pursue stable exchange rate. Further, firms in Caribbean seeds need to consider, as I said at the top of my presentation, the old-fashioned approach to production decision by building inventories to cushion effects like what we have experienced so far with this COVID-19. So Caribbean seeds are not helpless in all of this. They have room within which to maneuver when faced with exogenous shock, like what COVID-19 has imposed on them. So I'll stop here and take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Can we move to Dr. Horton? Are you ready?
Okay. Yes, hi, how are you? How is everyone doing today? The global economy now is moving at a rapid pace in terms of how the Internet of Things is panning out. And what we're seeing is that the COVID-19 crisis has brought upon us a new way of doing business, a new way of thinking, and a new approach towards the fourth industrial revolution. Now, last year I wrote an article about a looming economic crisis that was expected in 2020. I wrote it about in August because most macroeconomists were speculating based on global geopolitical occurrences as well as global financial occurrences that there would be a financial crisis this year. First of which was the backward yield curve that we saw in August, showing that the short-term yields were paying off more than the long-term yields, which indicated that people were now more inclined to put their money in short-term instruments, which means that they were betting against the long-term. That plus sanctions that the United States imposed on China, $50 billion worth of sanctions. And the China responded by reimposing $50 billion worth of sanctions on the United States. Now, every one of us who study economics knows that trade barriers or barriers to trade is a deterrent to global economic output and activity. Now, the third was the Brexit, England leaving the EU and going on their own. This fourth, there was a reduction in the demand for German automobiles as a result of this. And fifth, there was other tension in Asia because of what was happening with Singapore and so on and so forth. So we understood from an economic standpoint that there was going to be a recession in 2020. Bear in mind, we did not know of this COVID crisis, but we knew that global output was going to fall. Now, where does that leave us? The Caribbean as a region, and I must speak about the region, intra-regional trade is less than 5% among us. And if you look at the EU as an example, intra-regional trade is about 40%. If you look at Latin America, intra-regional trade is about 25%. And every other trading bloc around the world, intra-regional trade is above the numbers that we speak of. So in this case, what we're basically saying is that we want to be in a position to be able to understand where we are and then make the right decisions in order to put us where we ought to be. Now, what does this mean? The Caribbean has been providing to the rest of the world, for the most part, the tourism product, because we are predominantly service-oriented industries. And as a result, the tourism product that we offer each of us is the same sun, sand, and sea that we're all familiar with. Now, in this case, what we're doing is that we cannot offer the same sun, sand, and sea to each other. You know, so when we are looking at the global market, we are thinking about, one, how do we increase output? Because that's a fundamental necessity now that we're in a slump. And two, where does that output go? Does it go to our international trading partners, or does that go to our regional trading partners? So the point is, we have to start now looking at ourselves as Caribbean countries to see how do we diversify our product offerings so that Barbados can have a different good offering than from what Trinidad or what Jamaica offers to the rest of the Caribbean, so that now we can increase the level of intra-regional trade. That is very important. With the advent of the Internet of Things, the fourth industrial revolution, there is now an increase for global logistic networking facilities. So applications that allow the free flow of goods between countries, applications that allow the free flow of goods within boundaries. If you look at Uber, so what is happening now is that the new world and the fourth industrial revolution is giving rise to what we call the gig economy. And the gig economy looks at workers that enter and leave job markets at their own will. So if you look at Uber as a taxi service, those who work for Uber can log on and do their work for any amount of time that they feel like. If you want to work for an hour, you just work for an hour, no boss. If you want to work for 12 hours, you work for 12 hours, no boss. Everything is strictly commission-based and designed on a platform for sharing of resources. Now, a lot of these sharing sites are going to be more prevalent in the future. If you want to talk about if you have services to offer, you can offer them on Fiverr. And what we're seeing is that the world is now moving in a way where we want to be able to stay far apart, but at the same time, stay close together in terms of goods and services and productive output. As where Jamaica is concerned, we have not been able to forge that bilateral relationship with Trinidad as the oil producers. And as a result, we have not been able to minimize or reduce our cost of production. And energy cost in the Caribbean is a major issue. I mean, global oil prices were even negative last month. and many Caribbean countries didn't get a chance to benefit because we didn't understand the global oil market, and two, we didn't have the capacity to store, as I heard my colleague mention earlier. So where do we go from here? We have to get rid of inefficient services, inefficient inputs, and oil, especially in the case of Jamaica, is one of these. Now, it is the government responsibility now to look at Petroja, look at what we have been offering ourselves as a people, and try to plug those loopholes so that we can become a big producer in the future. I mean, just a simple thing as mask production. A lot of people now have been making masks, and they sew these masks with machines that they plug in. If they were able to get cheaper electricity, then they would be able now to sell those masks cheaper to everyone who demands them. So in this case, we have to understand where we are, understand what we're doing, and understand that the economics is strictly mathematics. Inputs, process, outputs. And as long as we understand this, and we understand to minimize the cost of our inputs, then we will be in a position to maximize the revenue that we get from our outputs. The COVID-19 crisis is also having a negative impact on the balance of payments of many countries. The trade relationships, now you find out that a lot of countries now, they are not earning as much. And as a result, they cannot satisfy their foreign currency obligations at ease. Now, what is this highlighting to us? This is highlighting that we don't have what we call sustainable balance of payments. And in order for us to have a sustainable balance of payments, we collectively have to look at our import-export function. Now, when we were slaves, we did not have a choice because we were forced to produce to sell abroad. Sugarcane, tobacco, just to name a few of these crops. Now that we're free people, we don't remember the concept of mercantilism. So we tend to live in a consumption-based economy straight across the Caribbean, where at different levels. So some consume more than others. But the point is, we do not look at creating wealth for ourselves. So Jamaica, for example, we have a Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And that is the reason why we are where we are today. Because you cannot just be looking at creating jobs for a group of people and looking at growing the economy without looking at increasing the value of the output that you produce. And it's a fundamental principle because these are things that we have to understand. We can't be expecting to be selling tomatoes and we want to use the money to buy Audis. We have to get large quantities of tomatoes to benefit from economies of scale. So the point is, value proposition is going to be important. I have a paper entitled Establishing the Caribbean Cannabis Economy, publishing Drug and Alcohol Policy today in Europe. And basically that paper analyzes the prospects of the cannabis industry throughout the Caribbean. And my colleagues and I looked at how we now can specialize in different countries to increase trade among ourselves. So Jamaica, for example, that is good at producing high THC cannabis. We would specialize in that along with St. Vincent and other countries, while Guyana and Belize, who have large mainlands, can specialize in the production of hemp. In that case, we can trade cannabis for hemp among ourselves, and we have a lucrative industry taking place. So, as a Caribbean and as an economic union, we're not necessarily a monetary union yet because we don't have a common currency, but we are certainly an economic union through CARICOM. As an economic union, these are things that we have to address collectively as countries and as representatives of countries. If we are able to do so, then we'll have a bright future. If we are able to do so, then we will put ourselves in a position to be able to increase intra-regional trade. And I strongly believe that if we're able to do so, this will play a role in our ability to create wealth among ourselves. That is it for now. I want to thank you for inviting me, and then I'll hold for questions when the time arises. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Horton. I see you are definitely embracing the new normal. We'll now have...
Yes, we have to.
Definitely. We'll now have our final presenter, Dr. Don Marshall.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. My colleagues before me would have spoken, jump off to speak about the nature of the challenge that we face and some of the challenges that relate to accessing markets and so on. I want to leave our discussion though onto the tracks of discussing the nature of how deep and profound the global economic crisis is and its impact on its fiscal impact. The first is to do with recognizing that around the region, most of these economies are heavily reliant and dependent on tourism. And that tourism has brought for a number of these countries a level of development and a considerable contribution to the gross domestic product, to the extent to which you can argue that the retail sector, the import trade, which is the retail and import trading sector, leisure, hospitality services, a lot of persons gain many jobs in this area, although where the wages could be fairly moderate, and in some of these, and in some instances, the wages are pretty fine, but the bulk of the jobs tend, however, to be moderately paid and performed by women and others that are would have left school and might not have gone on to higher education and so on. The point, though, is that in Barbados and Bahamas alone, for example, between April and March, between 35,000 to 40,000 persons applied for unemployment benefit. And that is to say, they've been asking their social security schemes to respond to the crisis borne out by them losing jobs. And this is fundamental. This is a fundamental indicator and a strong indicator of the nature of the crisis that we face, where joblessness is on the rise at unprecedented levels. Indeed, when Arthur Lewis was writing in 1950 about industrialization in the British West Indies at the time and how to tackle the high unemployment problem, in terms of his notion of the large reserve of labor, he could not contemplate that going forward we would see this level of unemployment confronting the region, because in his model and in his view, we would have been pursuing some form of industrial deepening while taking advantage of the fact that we had attractive sand climate and the potential to grow our tourism industry, which we did. And so recognize that a loss of the tourism industry as a result of the collapse of the travel industry itself has meant that a number of companies now cannot make their contribution to government's revenues in terms of their corporate contributions. Also recognize that government continues to lose revenue. Governments in the region are losing revenue because of the fact that we are in the midst of this economic downturn. So you have governments losing revenue, you have governments losing through tourism, a source of earning foreign exchange. And so they're forced to undertake a number of policy options that they hitherto would balk at. And a moment on that, pre-COVID, a lot by way of the pursuit of finance sector-led development was constituted part and parcel of the fiscal planning throughout the region. One of the signal weaknesses of Caribbean economies, apart from them not being well diversified economies, is that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, the fiscal overtook the developmental, which is to say an emphasis on fiscal consolidation, financial sector-led growth meant that what we were simply doing in our budgetary conduct was engaging in ways that could satisfy credit rating agencies and international financial institutions, that we could satisfy investors too, that we could be fiscally responsible and leave larger questions to do with growing the productive sectors of our economy to financiers and investors, leaving it up to the market. Well, we are in a different moment now. And in this liminal moment where governments around the world have to intervene, have to spend, have indeed been, for example, 1 in 5 workers of the top 5 European economies at this point, as we speak, are responsible for paying salaries or contributing to salaries of workers. And we know that billions of dollars have been so far utilized to stave off the collapse of the small and medium-sized business sector in, as I said, the 5 leading European economies. The same could be true for the United States, that is also bankrolling small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as meeting household cash demands and personal income demands by way of direct payments. The Caribbean is undertaking its own response to that. And we know, for example, yesterday was budget day in Bahamas. And apart from announcing the need to tap into financing from one of the fund facilities of the IMF, I think it's the Rapid Finance Facility. Apart from that, the government has also been coming up with measures in order to increase its revenue, some printing of currency and so on. In Barbados, there is talk about savings bonds and so on, all in the need to raise the revenue and to be able to maintain employment levels and to continue to pay for some goods and services. But altogether we are in a dilemma, because fundamentally, finance for development models cannot work in this environment where the state is expected to play the leading role. Indeed, it is the last line of defense against economic ruin for many. There are many livelihoods that have been negatively affected, and this is compounded by the fact that there were pre-existing inequalities brought about largely to do with the austerity economics pre the COVID-19, because the austerity economics meant a reduction in the social spend, and it also meant in some cases public sector layoffs. So you're talking about a situation where we've had 10, 15 years of austerity economics, and now we're in a phase of experimental economics, because the advice that we're getting from different international financial agencies is that right now in this moment, everything must be done by governments to ensure or to ward off economic collapse. So very shortly, governments will be looking towards printing money, which is to say float treasury bills, bonds, and so on, to raise money to make up for the shortfall in revenue. And governments may also be entertaining or engaging unions and others with talk about salary cuts. And also discussions about household mitigation, which is to say to make sure the vulnerable populations in their households can receive some $300, for example, monthly, to ensure that they can purchase food, and so on. So the emergency situation of where we are right now demands a higher level of state intervention and bailout. But planning for that COVID future, a post-COVID future, has to begin now. And whatever plans are being crafted, whether it's to pursue a renewable energy future, whether it is to improve on on digitizing our government agencies, government sectors, and as well as the economy, whether it is moving towards deepening forms of regional integration through encouraging integrated production and so on. Regardless of the plans on the make, the governments have to confront the need for financing for development. As we speak, there is a UN conference going on under the title Financing for Development. In fact, most of the speeches have been completed, and they've gone on to a second segment of that, looking at debt management. But if we look at financing for development more squarely, we have to be insisting, we in the region have to lobby, be part of international efforts to encourage greater flexible financing. That is to say, the IMF, China, and other creditor nations and international lending institutions should agree to new forms and flexible forms of financing. We have some green shoots of that effort. And the case of the Republic of Congo is of particular interest because in last month, faced with some challenges to do with its debt payments to China, China negotiated with the Republic of Congo as well with the IMF to structure a package to suit the Republic of Congo's circumstance of being in the COVID and having to adjust and so on, coupled with the fact that they had a balance of payments problem and a debt servicing challenge to meet. Altogether, what we had was an adjustment in their debt servicing on the part of the Chinese, where the loan packages, the loans that they would have incurred moved from a 15-year timetable that was expiring to another 15 years. So as we speak, they've been given further space, further time to service their external debt to China. And as also part of that arrangement saw the IMF making available $449 million to assist the Congo Republic. Remember that this is an oil-producing export country, and faced with its crisis, it undertook that kind of arrangement. Ethiopia also in April approached China with a view of getting it to extend by another 15 years its own debt repayment and debt service obligations. So what it is that we're calling for, we in the region should be the first to be calling for trilateral engagement or more trilateral engagement with the IMF and China and countries that find themselves in financial emergencies at this point, in order to gain better terms and transparency in relation to the loans and the terms of debt repayment. The reason why I'm twinning China with the traditional international lending institutions is because you cannot ignore China in the current world economy and the setup. And throughout the first half of the last decade of the 20th century, we're talking between 1990 and 1995, for Western countries, the greatest source of inward direct investment was coming from China. Between 2000 and 2017, the greatest source of foreign direct investment came from China for developing countries and African countries. It is a partner that cannot be ignored. It is a country that has where 129 countries have become part and parcel of its Belt and Road infrastructure-based project. where there's lending with considerable concessions and so on. And while 129 have signed MOUs, there are about 89 countries that have gone further than the MOUs and have actually accessed development financing from China. Some of them went into debt distress, about 8 or 9 of them, and the majority of them present some best case examples of how to engage with China using different modalities and ensuring some degree of transparency. But now is the moment for the various threshold criteria that the IMF and the traditional Paris Club of donors and lenders would employ, that level of transparency that they would employ, the threshold criteria that they would employ to determine the amount of loans that a country can handle. Now is the time for great sharing in those transparency standards and protocols with China. The IMF recognized China as well as recognized its digital currency announced earlier this year. And we know that its renminbi currency was declared an international tradable currency. So the Cold War, the post-Cold War hang-up that we in the Caribbean and some others seem to have that suggests to us that we ought to look to China and other countries, donor creditor nations with suspicion while treating to traditional creditor nations of the West with open arms. We need to get away from that, because part and parcel of overcoming coloniality means you look around the world and you try to structure the best kinds of bargains and negotiations possible to ensure that you can access finance on concessional terms and not just simply complain about the narrow GDP criteria used for determining, on the part of the Paris Club, for determining which countries will benefit from concessional loans and which, by dint of being called middle-income countries, have to go on capital markets and borrow expensively. I'm saying that in this COVID moment, we've passed the Rubicon. We are crossing the Rubicon. Lending today, global lending today, is about patient capital. It's about patient lending. It's about avoiding the volatility of capital markets. It's about an end to that game of trying to perform for credit rating agencies only to pass certain kinds of fiscal consolidation litmus tests. We have to recognize that this moment is different. And finally, if you're saying that this moment is different and that we must approach our fiscal planning tied to developmental goals and signposts, then it means that the policy elite ready to finance sector recovery has to change tack or be replaced by other kinds of policy advisors. Because if we as Caribbean countries continue to have in command policy elites still tied to yesterday's logic, all you're going to do is end up cannibalizing the remaining levels of employment by taxing persons who hold jobs now more and more, by constraining your spending. And I'll give you a classic example of what I mean. We have the absurdity right here in Barbados of the IMF insisting that Barbados's fiscal target of achieving a 6% surplus, a fiscal surplus of 6%, be reduced to 1%. And some of our leading policy elite and some leading members of the policy commentariat are applauding. And I'm thinking, no country in this world should be pursuing a balanced budget or surplus on its budget. That's absurd. Not at this time. Not when everybody's supposed to be engaged in deficit spending just to get the economy moving. So if you have, therefore, persons shaping the fiscal and budgetary agenda today in the Caribbean wedded to notions of financial sector-led growth and notions of financial sector reform as an end goal in itself to just simply woo investors. I think we need to recognize that that paradigm is shot, it's moribund, and that we need more developmental type economists and advisors to assist in rebuilding and assist in industrial deepening. The fiscal policy space that my colleague spoke about earlier can only be possible in circumstances where governments are free to shape an industrial policy. Austerity economics is about reducing government spend and the scope and space for shaping and framing an industrial policy. We now can get to the hard work of doing that to ensure true diversification of our economies, and a situation long postponed because of the multiple gains that we have grown accustomed to receiving and gaining from by dint of the growth of the tourism industry over the last 40 years or so. But now we see that we are going to be in a 2-year interregnum in relation to recovery of the tourism industry. So now is a good time to bend our collective mind and reshape the policy agenda around industrial deepening. And I suppose at another time, in another forum, we can begin to identify those new possible growth areas. But I did mention renewable energy. I did mention possibilities to explore our big oceans and agriculture and adding value to agriculture and most of what we do, raising the value added profile. But that's another conversation. I'll yield at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Thank you to our 3 panelists. Let's get straight to the questions because we have a lot coming in. How best can Jamaica come out of COVID-19 without a lot of debt, Jamaica or the Caribbean? How would debt cancellation work for Jamaica, and how can we get our debtors to agree to this cancellation, considering that we owe most of our debt to locals? Having just completed what has been described as the toughest IMF agreement in history, and Jamaicans preparing to finally reap the reward of the sacrifices, can the Jamaican economy withstand any other austerity at this time? Could this be the straw that breaks the camel's back? And finally, with interest rate trending downwards towards 0 or even negative, and the government pumping money in the economy with cash programs while normal economic activities are unable to resume, will we be experiencing something greater than simple inflation? Is it possible for regular savings, pension funds, etc., to be completely wiped out? I hand it over to the panel.
Well, those are a number of questions. I can't tackle all, but I'll just make a brief comment and then allow my colleagues to also intervene. Look, I think one of the first things I think we need to do as a region is sit down and reflect on what kinds of arrangements, what kinds of bargains we are going to engage when we're dealing with international financial institutions going forward. Because I'm not sure if we're sitting up and taking note as to what the IMF is doing in parts of Africa, what is actually saying in open fora about debt forgiveness and so on and so forth. It's also making available monies to assist countries in this post-lockdown world economy. And I don't know if we're getting the best bargains that we ought to be getting from the IMF. I mentioned the Barbados case where we are still asked to balance our, in fact, not balance our budget, achieve a fiscal surplus target of 1%. I make no bones about it, that is extremely shocking. And it will embarrass the institution if we in the region especially as small island developing states, simply as a united group of countries, say the COVID-19 is posing such a structural and profound crisis for our economies, tied as they were and for a long time to the services sector, that we need a package that better suits our circumstance. And certainly we cannot operate on the basis of balancing our budgets. And secondly, the question about debt. I mean, my colleagues might be more versed than I on this question, but of particular concern will be our external debt obligation and servicing those debts. I know a new conversation emerged around debt to GDP ratios following attempts to measure the debt by way of compiling the data of one's debt exposure locally, along with one's debt obligation, a country's debt obligation internationally. You came up with a compound figure, and we find ourselves 120% over GDP, 170% over GDP, and there's been a discourse around how that proves the point of our fiscal indiscipline and proves the point of our over-indebtedness. But there was an understanding about the local component of one's debt and the external component of one's debt. And the litmus test used to be in the 80s and 90s, your capacity as a country to manage your external debt obligations. This is not to say that you ignore your obligations to local creditors, no. But there was this understanding. And in most of the debt rescheduling efforts that I have seen, sovereign governments have been able to get their way and to settle terms with local creditors much easier than trying to settle terms with external creditors, because its sovereignty power cannot be extended beyond its shores. So it can cajole, persuade, and instruct local creditors that this is what the deal is. This is what we can afford. And local creditors have to more or less be in a situation where they take it on the basis of being patriotic, on the basis of being compassionate with the argument being put forward about what the economy can afford and what it cannot afford. So for me, the question is, if we're going to talk about debt sustainability, we need to ask of the individual Caribbean countries, what is your external debt obligation? What is the nature of, how expensive is that for you? And can that be lowered? And can that be lowered by negotiation with external creditors at this moment? But that's my take for now.
Okay, let me jump in here on the debt issue. You need to understand that developing countries, in particular states, creditors will not lend states, will not make loans to states in their own currency. In other words, a creditor, say on international market, will not lend, say Guyana or even Jamaica in their own currency. Because of what? Because of the risk that are associated with small island developing states like ours, and in some cases, the risk premium that creditors associate with their loans. In some cases, those risks are unfounded. For example, political instability, the inability of states to repay loans, and just from paying makes creditors unable or unwilling to make loans to states in their own currency, and that drives up the rate at which these countries, these seats have to pay. Now, secondly, debt is not entirely, debt does not deserve the stigma that many of us associated with it. Countries borrow under one condition. Let me repeat. Country borrow under one condition, or country should borrow under one condition when it is emergency. For example, in the case of the COVID-19, which is a disaster-like shock, it's an exogenous shock, something that is coming from outside, not something that is generated within. You can, in Jamaica, Hurricane Gilbert, it's a disaster. So in that case, we expect countries to borrow. We don't expect countries to borrow when for engaging wasteful spending. We do not expect that. And the reason why SIDS, Small Island Developing States have to pay high premium on loans is because of the possibility of authorities, political elites engage in wasteful spending and therefore unable to pay back these loans, right? So I expect countries to be spending in excess of their revenues at this stage. Now, if a large share of a country's debt is denominated in local currency, that is not a problem. That is not a problem, because what is going on here is that you're borrowing from yourself. So you can think about a country making a creditor in a country giving the government loans. That's okay, because you're borrowing from yourself. It's like a son, a parent borrowing from his son. That money is kept within the family. And so whatever the government repays the domestic creditor, that payment will be spent largely in the economy. So that's not a problem. The problem is when you have to, as a small island developing state, has to borrow from external sources, and therefore the loan is denominated in foreign currency, which means that if there's a balance of payment issue, if there's a balance of payment shock, then you find yourself in problem. Okay, so let's not give debt a bad name or stigmatize debt. Countries borrow under one condition when there's a disaster. So you expect governments to be running deficit. No, that's what you expect.
Yeah, man. If I may intervene, Kevin.
And as the economy improves, then we expect government to run at least budget surplus. Okay?
Man.
Okay, go ahead.
Can I address the question now? Countries have to borrow in foreign currency because they need the money to satisfy their foreign currency obligations. Speaking for Jamaica, we have foreign currency problems in terms of our receipts, because our three main foreign currency earners, tourism, bauxite, and remittances, have all fallen significantly. As a result, we do not have the supply of foreign currency that is necessary to satisfy our foreign currency obligations. So in this case, we can't borrow in Jamaican currency as an example. If we want Jamaican currency, it would be better if the government embark on some type of printing or whatever the case may be. But you can't borrow in your currency at that time, because that is the reason you're borrowing. If you wanted your currency, then you probably could print it if you need your currency. But you need a currency to participate in global trade and global commerce. That is what you want. So you need a reserve currency. Now, Jamaica went to the IMF recently to get additional funding. And that is indicating to us the illusion that our reserves are. You know what I mean? Think about it as you go into the embassy to get a visa. And when you go there, they say you don't have enough funds. Now, when you go to there to get the visa and don't have enough funds, you then link your auntie and tell her to put your name on your account. Your auntie have $1 million in her account. When your auntie put your name on the account, you go back, they say, okay, yes, you have some money in your auntie, them get the visa. But when you get to America and you want to make foreign purchases, now you want to go shopping, you realize you don't have access to your auntie money because your auntie's money is just there for show. It's not yours to spend as you have a likes. So Jamaica, for example, have $3.2 billion worth of reserves. But with the cash flow of the reserve, it's not liquid. So we need it at this point in time now. That is why we have to go into the IMF now to get this emergency funds set aside. That means that if it is the case that we run out, we can access it right away. Now, the sustainability of the balance of payments comes to fore because it brings into consideration a lot of issues. Our debt to GDP ratio, and I heard my colleague speak about Barbados 1%. Ours is 3.5. And the who we borrow from, we should know that they do not care about anything other than getting back their money at a premium. So it's not as if they care about what we want to do with the money. To them, they don't really care. It is up to us to care what we do with the money when we get it, how we spend it, how we do not mismanage it, how we minimize corruption when dealing with it. The interest rate policy, I mean, Jamaica's interest rate now is at 0.5%, which means that we have little room to use monetary policy as an economic agent to stimulate growth. The interest rate that we borrow much of these foreign currency for, though it has fallen over the last 2 decades, is still too high given global geopolitical occurrences. So we want to be in a position to be able to balance our receipts with our expenditure obligations. I mean, Jamaica, I spoke about the idea of odious debt in 2011. And a debt becomes odious if, for example, a creditor knows that the government is going to use it for nonsense and still lend them. Much of Jamaica's borrowing has been in this regard. They have not used these borrowed funds in the most efficient manner. And that gives us a case to ask for foreign debt relief. But as you realize, if you are not a lesser developing country, you won't get access to foreign currency. Jamaica is a lower middle income country. They tend not to give us the sort of waivers that we deserve. And you could look at it from the last IMF agreement. Greece got some amount of benevolence. Haiti got some amount of benevolence. But Jamaica did not. And it is illustrating to us that we need to take our own macroeconomics more seriously as we go along.
Can I make a final point on the debt? I think
Sure.
the concern here is that whether Jamaica and Barbados and the other countries in the Caribbean who are facing high debt to GDP ratio is whether their ability to is whether they're able to use that debt to generate capacity to repay the debt. So if you are able to grow the economy, you're able to use that loan to generate real economic activity, then there's not a concern there. I made the point earlier that if you use the loans to engage in wasteful spending, then we expect you to be trapped in that low equilibrium. If you use the debt to generate economic activity so that you can repay, so that you can repay the debt, then that is not a problem. The concern here is whether countries, for example, Jamaica, is able to grow the economy so that we can sustain our debt level and further bring it down. I see where there's a projection for the government of Jamaica to reduce its debt to GDP ratio to 60% by 2020. The COVID-19 has distort that projection, push it 2 years in the future to 2028. That is aspirational. Let's see how that goes. But please note that the authorities, our political elites, finally, they're realizing that in order to escape the debt trap that has bedeviled Jamaica for the past, several decades, to get out of the debt trap, you have to grow the economy. There is no getting over, there's no getting under, there's no getting around that. You have to grow the economy. In other words, the interest rate at which you repay must be below the growth rate in the economy. So R must be greater than I in this case. Thanks.
Okay, should tourism be our main focus right now? If not, what should be our main focus? Should conversations of diversification from tourism as well as primary commodities be had, since both have a high dependency on world markets?
Well, I think we need to start off by accepting that our economies have to be marked by many domains of activity, and it should not reflect a sort of monocrop or monosector kind of bias. And for a long time, a number of our economies have been marked by one or two sectors driving its economic fortune. So we would have tourism and international business. And in some countries, in some we would have tourism and bauxite, as my colleague Andre would have mentioned, Jamaica. We would have had tourism, oil, petrochemical sector, and some light to medium goods manufacture in Trinidad. Trinidad being perhaps the most diverse economy in the region, and perhaps an object lesson in its capacity to sustain some shocks when they do arise. But ultimately, the conversation has to move at this point beyond and around tourism. By that I mean, one classic example would be this. We have all this capacity in terms of hotel space and so on, but workplace 2020, the post-lockdown workplace and the post-COVID workplace will tend to feature the phenomenon of people working from home, and more in large sectors of the economies of Western and Asian countries. And the moment is right for persons interested in promoting the growth of the international business sector, which has its leanings towards tourism, to attract and woo persons, those in their 20s and 30s, to come to the Caribbean and live and work here, use the Caribbean as a space to engage in remote work. That is to say, you could be here in the Caribbean, working in the best kind of high-tech environment, and know for sure that you're able to meet your productivity standards and expectations of your company or firm home in Nebraska or home in Hong Kong or whatever. The point I'm making is that being asked to work remotely from home means that you're not at your job, at the physical location. You're in your home, and that home could be anywhere. It could be in any of the idyllic destinations that offer timeshares, that offer affordable Airbnb arrangements, affordable packages for you to purchase homes, villas, etc. And persons could be working from those spaces once there is, of course, the right kind of bandwidth, the right kind of networks, the right kind of infrastructure improvements, telecommunications, and other ways for them to conduct their work. Now, there are countries in the region that will be best positioned to seize and build upon that opportunity. And that would be those countries that have for a long time gained some foothold in the area of international business in both wealth management and administrative management. So you could perceive that a Bermuda, a Bahamas, a Barbados, these countries can pay some attention to improving their telecommunications environment, their work towards 4G and 5G networks, and seek to take advantage of those mobile jobs where work is done and understood to be done remotely. So I just mentioned that would be like augmenting tourism, but there are some low-lying fruit that can be pursued. And this is if you start to think about our food and beverages industries, how can we augment or raise the value added in these? The same thing with seeking to secure food security and government targeted programs at growing fruit trees, at growing more and more produce. And so I'll just yield at this point because I know other colleagues want to jump in on this, but there are quite a few things that we can do immediately. And I would just want to make a plug though for the Caribbean to contemplate as a region or as a significant block of countries to contemplate regional transportation capacity in the form of ferries. Because perhaps if we can secure 2 ferries during this COVID period, within the next, say, 6 to 12 months, we can get some regional ferry traffic reliable and sufficiently endowed to carry our trade and carry persons around the region. I think that will also be a great fillip towards boosting our economies and hopes.
Okay.
Dr. Williams, can I just?
Okay.
I want to get through the questions. I want to direct a question to Dr. Horton and then one to you. So what's stopping interregional trade in the Caribbean? Regional trade has several far-reaching opportunities. But where do you think it should start? Should it be on a physical level and just start trading, or should policies be made first? Then the second question directed to Dr. Williams. Structural rigidities must be addressed for Caribbean economies to do better. What, in your opinions, are preventing true production integration within CARICOM?
Please repeat my question.
All right, excellent. Let me answer the first question first, Kevin, and then you answer the second question. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Our debt scenario within the Caribbean. Remember that in order to trade, you must have something that somebody else need, and they must have something that you need. And then that is how trade comes into play. What has been preventing us as Caribbean nationals to trade is that most predominant, we grow the same types of agricultural products. We offer the same type of tourism services. So the only difference would, for example, be the mining that Jamaica has and the oil that Trinidad has. But you realize Guyana produces a lot of rice. They have this ability. Belize provides a lot of logging. They have this ability. But because of the long-term geopolitical relationship that these countries have had with each other, it is taking a toll on our present day ability to integrate as a people. Point in notice the referendum back in the 1950s, 60s. And Eric Williams said 1 without 10 is 0 where Jamaica is concerned. From that, Jamaica and Trinidad has not been able to develop this hardcore interrelationship in trade that we want to see. As a result, Jamaica has to be purchasing oil at a high rate from other countries. And there are a lot. So the point is, in order for us to increase intra-regional trade, we must first begin to diversify the types of goods that each country produces. And when we can do so, then we will be in a better position to say, okay, let us open up trade. Because trade is a natural thing. It's a natural thing. Economics is dependent on individuals who are natural beings. And as a result, if you are providing, for example, a good or service that your neighbor has, they won't want to buy it from you. They can swim at home. They can get the sugar at home. They can purchase their needs at home. So let us look at, and as it relates to policy, we have policy. We have labor laws among CARICOM countries. We have, so the key here, if we're going to implement policy, then for example, the policy, I don't know, and it's going to be difficult for us to do that, but it is going to say these countries produce this, these countries produce that, and then share and trade amongst each other. So Guyana, for example, has a natural advantage in rice. So we've been buying a lot of rice from Guyana, you know? So these are the things that we need to see expanded.
Dr. Williams, do you want me to repeat the question?
Sure, please, thanks.
Structural rigidities must be addressed for Caribbean economies to do better. What, in your opinion, is preventing true production integration within CARICOM?
I think, as Dr. Arnton intimated, we have, even though we all are plantation economies, we have different historical orientation. So for example, I remember some time ago when Patrick Manning was trying to sell oil to Jamaica at a discounted price. He got pushback from the population from doing that, and that was surprising. I mean, you do not expect that, given that we're a part of the same CARICOM region. We are touting CARICOM, that we are one unit economic bloc, and so on. So you know, Trinidad, even though they're a part of the CARICOM region, and you would expect that Trinidad would sell Jamaica oil at discounted rate. No, we have seen in Trinidad where it's Jamaican private sector during I think about a few years ago complained that Trinidad it was difficult to get into the market in Trinidad. So those are some of the, you know, some of the subtle barriers to true integration, to true movement of goods and goods across regional countries in the region. So there's one argument that Jamaican the private sector in Jamaica, they look beyond the Caribbean market towards international markets. For example, if you go, say, in England, you'll see a lot of Jamaican products in Tesco, Sainsbury, Lidl, and so on, relative to what you see in Trinidad. So you ask the question, why is that so? And Jamaica and Trinidad were a part of the same, same region. We're part of the same economic bloc. So there are subtle differences that generate barriers between for free movement of goods. Right.
Okay, colleagues, we're getting ready to wrap up. Time is now against us. So these are our final two questions, and it's open to the panel together with your closing comments. What have we gotten right in the COVID-19 transition? I'm guessing in reference to the Caribbean. And tell me two solutions that any Caribbean country can implement right away to help recover from COVID-19. So it's open to the panel.
Okay, let me jump here. What have we gotten right? Well, over the past 7 years, Jamaica has taken steps. We have finally recognized, our political elites, that we cannot build a country on credits. We cannot build a country on borrowing. We have to grow ourselves. We have to grow the economy. And the COVID-19 has magnified that truism, that you have to grow the economy, and you have to grow, and economic growth has to be sustained. It has to be sustained. So that idea, that truism has come clearly to the fore, that if Jamaica is going to go forward, if Barbados is going to go forward, and Barbados' debt to GDP ratio in Barbados is higher than Jamaica. And these countries now realize that you have to, you need economic growth to move the country forward. And therefore, if you are able to grow the economy, pursue sound macroeconomic policies, grow the economy, generate reserve, so that when we have a disaster-like shock, as the COVID-19, we will be able to cushion the effects. I turn over to my colleagues for their response.
Yeah, man, definitely. We are in a good position. I mean, in terms of what we've been doing right, I mean, for Jamaica, we've been trying to reduce our debt. Collectively, the Caribbean has much to be done. We have to start now thinking collectively. We have to start thinking smartly. We have to start thinking about how best we can increase the value of what we produce collectively. And not just increase the value of what we produce, but increase the diversity of our offerings so that we can trade among ourselves better.
I think what we got right was to sit down as a region under the chair of the current chair, Prime Minister Mia Mottley. I think the region sat together and agreed on some degree of the easing of restrictions, and they have settled issues, or began to explore issues about opening borders for each other, to ensure regional exchange of goods and so on. I think they've started that conversation, and insofar as that dialogue has in fact begun, and there's an attempt to sequence and cohere strategies around open borders for greater business and trade within the region. I applaud that. In terms of what we can do immediately, we have to recover before we can begin to grow. And I think that we haven't sat here to recognize, we didn't get to explore it, but we need to recognize that just as we talk about a possibility of a second wave in relation to COVID, I think we should also recognize that the post-lockdown economy could actually fare worse than what it is right now. We seem to be thinking about what has happened the last 2 months in relation to the collapse of the international airline industry, missing that there are huge gaps in the normal levels and the normal economic everyday activity that still are to be filled. So that, for example, once businesses have to operate with social distancing in place, we can expect the economy may shrink further. Other chunks of everyday life that remain missing is things like leisure, travel. There's a dip in fund spending. Women aren't buying shoes and handbags and that kind of thing now. And the emphasis is on food. And by people's voluntary acts, what you're seeing is that people are locked down or not locked down. Fears of infection lead people to just simply go to work and return home. So that's going to, hit further the economy. But I think one thing that we should begin to start to think about now are those vulnerable groups, particularly, and I'm talking about households and households that are not seeing any incomes, and women who have to manage a triple or quadruple work day, in that they're asked to attend to work, attend to homeschooling, attend to managing the household, while also they're expected to sustain levels of productivity working remotely from home. Where they're not working remotely from home, they're expected to somehow miraculously pull off childcare in between there. So these are the kinds of stresses and strains that could shatter confidence and so on. So my recommendation is that governments move swiftly in the direction of household mitigation and finding ways to finance vulnerable households. That would be...
Okay, colleagues, we are coming to the end of our event today. Our next live webinar is scheduled to take place on June 5th, and it's entitled New Economy Models Post-COVID-19. Details of this event will be made public soon. I would like to close by thanking you, the audience, for your time and enthusiasm. I would like to thank our very prepared and knowledgeable presenters. I'd like to thank our Solicitors Fellows on the Planning Committee led by Dr. Kevin Williams. Also, Mr. Richard Leach for all his technical support, and Mr. Oren Spence for the marketing of this event. Lastly, thank you once more to our University Director, Professor Audrey Henry Lee, for her leadership and the support from our campus directors, Dr. Don Marshall and Dr. Hamid Ghani. Thank you, everyone. Continue to remain safe, follow the health updates, and practice social